They say childhood is the golden season, the years before responsibility, soft and unhurried, like sunlight through a bedroom window on a slow morning. But what happens when the window shatters? What happens when a generation doesn't simply grow up but grows up through something? Through the static of news broadcasts they weren't supposed to understand. Through the silence of adults who didn't know what to say. Through the strange arithmetic of loss, names on lists, cities on maps, faces that disappeared and never came back. The Iraq War began in 2003, but for an entire generation in the Middle East, in America, in the diaspora scattered between, it didn't begin on a news ticker. It began in the body, in the gut, in the slow, quiet rewiring of what it means to feel safe. This is not a political film, this is a human one. This is about what grows in the soil of interrupted childhoods, and what it costs, even now, decades later, to carry what was never meant to be carried so young. There is a particular kind of memory that doesn't live in the mind. It lives lower, in the chest, in the hands, the way they tighten around nothing when a certain sound plays too loudly. For an entire generation, the Iraq War did not arrive as history, it arrived as sensation. It arrived as a television left on too long in a room where someone forgot a child was still sitting, as hushed conversations behind closed doors, as a father's jaw going rigid at dinner, as a classroom that felt heavier on a Monday in March, as if the ceiling had dropped an inch overnight. Children don't process catastrophe the way adults do. Adults reach for language, for frameworks, but children reach for the emotional temperature of the room. They read faces the way ancient navigators read the sky, and when those faces change, when the adults who were supposed to be lighthouses begin flickering, something shifts, quietly, permanently. Psychologists call this secondary traumatization, trauma transmitted not through direct experience but through proximity, through absorption, through the terrifying sensitivity of a nervous system that doesn't yet know how to filter what it takes in. But for children who lived inside the geography of war, in Baghdad, in Mosul, in Basra, the experience was not secondary at all. The word checkpoint became a word that changed the air in the car. School, if it continued, became a strange performance of normalcy, pencils and notebooks, while the world outside rewrote itself in smoke. Here is what all these children shared, regardless of geography. The moment the world broke open, they were watching. And the watching changed them, not in ways they could name then, but in the slow, cellular way that formative experience always changes people, quietly rewriting what safety would feel like from that point forward. Because the brain of a child is not a finished thing. It is a landscape mid-formation, shaped by the emotional climate it inhabits, the way stone is shaped by water, not all at once, slowly, and with extraordinary permanence. The war did not simply happen to this generation, it happened inside them. There is something a child needs before they need anything else. Not food, not education, not even love in its most articulate form. They need to believe that the ground will hold. Psychologists call it felt safety, the deep, wordless conviction that the world is, at its core, a place where one can exist without bracing, where the body doesn't need to be a fortress. It is the psychological oxygen of childhood, and for an entire generation who came of age during the Iraq War, that oxygen thinned. Not all at once. Safety doesn't always leave in a single moment. More often, it leaves the way warmth leaves a room when a window is left open in winter, gradually, imperceptibly, until you realize you've been cold so long you've stopped noticing. You've simply adjusted, contracted, learned to live in a smaller, more guarded version of yourself. John Bowlby spent decades revealing something almost unbearably simple. The quality of a child's early emotional environment becomes the internal model through which they interpret all future relationships and all future risk. When that environment is stable, the child internalizes what researchers call a secure base, a quiet confidence that the world can be explored because there is somewhere safe to return. But what happens when the adults themselves are no longer stable? When the very figures who were supposed to be the ground become people also searching for ground? For children of this era, this was not hypothetical. It was Tuesday. It was a mother who held on slightly too long when she said goodbye, just long enough for a child's nervous system to register the question embedded in the embrace. Will you come back? Will I? And so, without instruction, children began to adapt. They became readers of atmosphere. They learned to scan a room before entering, to assess the adults, to modulate their own needs, to become very good at being small, undemanding, invisible. Psychologists call this hypervigilant attachment, a relational style born not from dysfunction but from intelligence, from the survival logic of a nervous system that learned the environment required monitoring. But intelligence deployed as survival always carries a cost. The child who made themselves small in wartime becomes the adult who doesn't know how to ask for what they need in peacetime. The child who read every room for danger becomes the adult who cannot fully relax inside of love, who waits, even in tenderness, for the temperature to change. That memory doesn't expire. It simply waits, patient and quiet, in every room where the stakes feel high enough to matter. The human brain is not born finished. Unlike most animals whose neural architecture arrives largely complete, the human brain spends the first 2 decades of life in active, experience-dependent construction. It builds itself from the raw material of what happens to it. Which means what surrounds a child doesn't simply influence them, it becomes them. For this generation, the repeated experience was threat, not always direct, not always visible, but present in the emotional field of the home, in the news living inside the television, in the collective anxiety that moved through communities like weather, touching everything. The amygdala, the brain's primary threat detector, functions like a sensitive alarm system, activating in response to genuine danger and quieting once danger passes. But when threat becomes chronic, the amygdala recalibrates. It becomes sensitized, its threshold lowers. It begins to find threat in ambiguity, in the uncertain, the unfamiliar, the not yet explained. Simultaneously, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational evaluation and emotional regulation, is, in children and adolescents, still developing, still building its connections to the very structures it is meant to regulate. This is the neurological tragedy at the heart of childhood trauma. The alarm system matures faster than the off switch. Researchers studying populations exposed to chronic conflict have documented consistent patterns, elevated cortisol baselines, as though the body never received the signal that the emergency had ended. Altered sleep, heightened startle responses, a nervous system that moves from calm to activated faster than the conscious mind can track. These are not character flaws. They are the fingerprints of an intelligent nervous system that built itself for a specific environment, and then found itself, years later, carrying that architecture into a world that no longer matched the blueprint. There's a concept called allostatic load, the cumulative biological cost of chronic stress. Think of it as the weight the body carries when the stress response is activated too frequently without adequate recovery. That weight doesn't disappear when the stressor does, it redistributes. It settles into the body's baseline, into the precise way a person's chest tightens when uncertainty arrives unannounced. For this generation, that load was accumulated during the years when the brain was most impressionable. And it was accumulated in silence, because no one named what their nervous systems were doing or what it would mean for the adults they were quietly becoming. That exhaustion has a name now. It has a neuroscience, a history, a generation it belongs to, and knowing that, even just knowing that, changes something. There is a moment, and almost everyone who lived through something too large for childhood can locate it, when the feelings simply stopped arriving. Not dramatically. One day the news broadcast played and the chest tightened. And then, months later, the same broadcast played and there was nothing. A strange, flat quiet where the feeling used to be. As though someone had turned a dial incrementally until the volume of the interior world dropped below the threshold of perception. This is not numbness in the casual sense. This is a survival architecture. The psychological term is emotional blunting, the mind's extraordinary capacity to create distance between the self and an experience too large to be fully felt in real time. It is not a failure of sensitivity. It is evidence of the opposite. Only a system that felt deeply enough to be overwhelmed develops the mechanism to protect itself from that overwhelm. Think of it as the psyche's circuit breaker. For children of the Iraq War era, this circuit breaker was called upon constantly. The Iraqi child who watched neighborhoods transform, The American child who watched the casualty count rise on the evening news like a slow, terrible odometer. The diaspora child who learned to perform normalcy at school while carrying something unnameable home each afternoon. Each of them in their own geography learned a version of the same lesson, feeling everything is not survivable, so feel less. And they were right. The numbing was not pathology, it was precision, the psyche making a rational calculation under irrational conditions, trading the full range of feeling for the ability to continue functioning. But survival strategies are not designed with the future in mind. And so the child who learned to blunt their fear also began to blunt other things. Joy began to feel suspicious, too exposed, too temporary. Grief arrived in strange, displaced ways. Intimacy began to require courage no one had mentioned, the courage to feel on purpose in the presence of another person when everything in the trained body said, keep the dial turned low. These adults are often described by others as calm, remarkably steady in crisis, because crisis is the register they were trained in. It is the ordinary tenderness they struggle with, the quiet Tuesday evening with nothing threatening on the horizon. How do you tell someone that feeling safe feels unsafe? That love in its most open form triggers the same alertness as threat? You often don't. You simply keep the dial where it is, and wonder quietly why connection always stops just short of complete. There is a particular kind of child that war produces, not the child who breaks visibly, who cries in the right moments, whose need announces itself. That child, at least, is legible. This chapter is about a different kind, the child who becomes, almost imperceptibly, useful. Who learns, through precise reading of what the adults around them need, that the most valuable thing they can offer is not their childhood, but their steadiness. Their willingness to step, quietly and without ceremony, into roles that were never designed for someone their size. Psychologists call this parentification, but the word doesn't fully hold what it describes. It doesn't capture the 10-year-old translating not just language but emotion for a grieving parent newly arrived in a foreign country. The teenager who decided their grief was a luxury the family could not afford and filed it away, carefully, in a place they intended to return to and somehow never did. These children did not choose this, nor did their parents deliberately ask for it. The parentification of war-era children was the predictable mathematics of overwhelm. When adults carry more than any human being was designed to carry, displacement, loss, economic devastation, survivor's guilt, the system redistributes the weight. And children, with their deep instinct for the emotional climate of home, absorb more than anyone realizes. They become the ones who don't add to the pile, who sense which conversations will make the evening harder and so don't begin them, who develop a competence in adult concerns, in worry, in forward-scanning anxiety, long before their peers have thought about anything beyond the immediate. And the world, misunderstanding what this costs, calls them mature. You're so mature for your age, said with admiration, as though maturity in a child is an uncomplicated gift rather than what it so often is, evidence of a childhood that the circumstances quietly repossessed. Because premature maturity takes specific things. It takes the beautiful, necessary selfishness of a person who is supposed to be primarily concerned with their own becoming. It takes the permission to be confused, needy, uncertain, to fall apart in small ways that someone older can witness and absorb. It takes the experience of being, fully and without apology, the one who is held. The child who never received those things becomes an adult who doesn't know how to ask for them, who finds a familiar pull toward caretaking in every relationship, who mistakes self-sufficiency for strength and exhaustion for virtue because needing nothing was the most generous thing they knew how to offer. That grief surfaces in unexpected places, in the heaviness of watching children play with a freedom that somehow passed too quickly, in a tiredness that sleep doesn't resolve, in the bewilderment of an adult who is competent at almost everything except receiving care. Wars do not end on the dates assigned to them, not in the body. The external war has a timeline historians can mark, but the internal war follows a different calendar. It ends when it ends, which is to say, sometimes it doesn't end at all. It simply changes terrain, moving from the landscape outside the body to the landscape inside it, into relationships, into recurring thought patterns, into the strange emotional weather of an adult life carrying, embedded in its atmosphere, the residue of what was witnessed and never fully processed. For this generation, adulthood arrived with invisible luggage, not the kind that announces itself, the kind that makes a person slightly harder to reach than they appear. That makes a seemingly ordinary moment, a news broadcast, a particular quality of collective anxiety in a public space, suddenly feel like a door opening onto something much older and much heavier than the present moment contains. Because for many in this generation, the Iraq War was not simply a political event. It was a mirror held up to their identity at the exact moment identity was being formed. For Arab and Muslim communities in the Middle East and across the diaspora, the war arrived as external catastrophe and internal crisis simultaneously. To be Iraqi or Arab or Muslim in the years following 2003 was to find one's identity refracted through a geopolitical lens that reduced and surveilled. To walk through the world as a young person still forming their sense of self while the world formed its sense of you through headlines, through airport security lines, through the experience of being looked at as a category rather than a person. Psychologists studying identity development in conflict-affected youth describe what they call identity foreclosure under threat, the way external pressure causes a young person's sense of self to calcify prematurely around a defensive posture, rather than expanding organically through exploration. The self stops asking who am I and begins asking how do I survive being who I am. Then there is moral injury, the fracture in the foundational belief that the world operates according to principles of fairness and human dignity. A fracture that makes certain forms of trust in institutions, in collective systems, genuinely difficult to reconstruct. And so the adult from this generation carries a specific guardedness, not cynicism, not nihilism, something more painful, a person who wants to believe in the possibility of justice but who carries in their body the historical evidence that it doesn't always come, that sometimes the world watches, deliberates, and moves on. Carrying that knowledge in the middle of an ordinary life while trying to build something stable and loving and hopeful is a specific and largely unacknowledged labor. The war moved inside, and it takes up space, quiet space, space that was meant perhaps for other things. There's a particular loneliness that belongs specifically to this generation, not the loneliness of isolation. Many in this generation are, by all visible measures, surrounded by friends, by family, by the ambient connectivity of a world that has never been more technically linked. This is a different loneliness, the loneliness of carrying something that has no commonly agreed upon name, of having been shaped by a history the world processed as a political event, debated in parliaments, argued over at dinner tables while you processed it privately in the body, silently, incompletely. It is the loneliness of being a generation that was never quite asked, how are you doing with this, not the political this, the human this, the weight of having come of age inside something that left marks on the nervous system, on the capacity for trust, on the interior architecture of identity and belonging. That question for most of this generation was never asked, and questions that are never asked don't disappear, they settle. They become part of the sediment of a person, the unexamined layer beneath the visible life, influencing everything that grows above it without ever quite being seen directly. But here is what is also true, and this matters perhaps more than anything else in this entire reflection. You are not the only one carrying it. Across the world, in Baghdad and in Brooklyn, in Mosul and in Manchester, in Erbil and in every city where Iraqi and Arab diaspora families rebuilt their lives, there are people who know exactly the particular weight this film has been describing, who recognize without needing it spelled out the feeling of a nervous system that learned vigilance too early, the complicated relationship with joy, the guardedness inside love. The moral exhaustion of carrying the knowledge of what the world is capable of, alongside the daily, quietly heroic project of building something worth living in any way. If this reflection felt familiar in places, if something in these words touched a part of you that doesn't often get touched, a part that has been patient and quiet and carrying more than it has been given space to set down, then know this, gently and without qualification, you are not alone in what you carry. There is an entire generation scattered across geographies, across languages, across the ordinary surfaces of adult lives that look nothing like what they survived, who knows the specific weight of coming of age inside something that left its mark before they had words to name the marking. You are part of that generation, And this space, this quiet corner of the internet, exists specifically for people like you, for people who think deeply about what shaped them, who are curious about the hidden architecture of human experience, who believe or are learning to believe that understanding is its own form of kindness toward oneself. If you'd like to stay connected, to return here when the weight feels heavier than usual, or when you want company in the kind of reflection that doesn't often find a home in ordinary conversation, you are warmly welcome to subscribe. Not as an obligation, simply as an open door left gently ajar for whenever you feel ready to walk through it. This channel is not simply content, it is a space where the hidden corners of the human heart are explored with care, where the experiences that don't often get named are given language, where you are never a category, never a statistic, but always simply a person whose inner life deserves to be taken seriously. If something in this reflection moved something in you, if a particular chapter named something you have been carrying without a name, you are welcome to share that in the comments in whatever words feel right or in no words at all. Sometimes your words left quietly below become the sentence that someone else needed to read to feel less alone. That is not a small thing. That is, in its own unassuming way, a form of healing for you and for whoever finds it there. You came of age inside something large and difficult and largely unwitnessed. You carried it with more grace than you were ever given credit for, and you are still here, still curious, still reaching in whatever way feels possible toward understanding. Take care of yourself. You always deserved gentleness,